HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Emancipation of the Mind, Radical Philosophy, the War Over Slavery, and the Refounding of America, by Matthew Stewart. Read by Mike Chamberlain. About this book. The humanities today are the unhappiest field of study, and one of their vulnerabilities, so easily exploited by the forces arrayed against them, is that the rewards they offer are often difficult to anticipate. You rarely know exactly where you are going until you get there, or what unexpected encounter might spark the epiphany. This book is a case in point. The first of several steps on the journey that led to the chapters that follow took place when I stumbled upon an unsettling, familiar reference to a caterpillar. For too long, I had no very plausible explanation for my decision to pursue graduate study in 19th century German philosophy. Sure, there was something inspiring in the idealism of those old radicals, and maybe something intoxicating in their ambition to liberate all humanity with their displays of philosophical virtuosity. I also had no trouble mustering the familiar platitudes about the greatness of great books, the urgent need to promote critical thinking, the imperative to educate a democratic citizenry, the importance of understanding our origins, and all that. But there was something quietly preposterous about devoting so much effort to parsing some old philosophical systems that few people have ever understood, and that have long been rusting in the junkyard of the history of ideas. Eventually, I wrote it off as my Teutonic episode and moved on. Then one day I happened to be leafing through some lectures that the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass delivered in the 1860s on the philosophy of photography. I was trying to make sense of the haunting fact that the single largest industry in the American Republic in the first century or so of its existence consisted in the enslavement and the breeding for enslavement of human beings. I was sure that Douglass would offer some perspective on the war over slavery. The detail that snagged my attention, however, was the caterpillar. Douglass refers to that insect to illustrate an argument that our consciousness, too, rarely extends beyond the leaf on which we happen to be feeding. The general point is to advance a surprisingly radical philosophical position according to which the world as we know it, with all its laws, morals, religions, and manners, begins and ends in the human mind, from which follows some bold insights into the struggle over slavery, and the nature of photography, for good measure. But never mind the general point. There will be plenty of time for that. I was pretty sure I knew where that caterpillar came from. Ludwig Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872, is remembered today, if at all, mainly by a dowdy band of leftover Marxists who celebrate him as the fiery brook over which one must pass on the road from reactionary idealism of G.W.F. Hegel, 1770 to 1831, to the revolutionary materialism of Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. For at least 15 minutes in the middle of the 19th century, however, Feuerbach was famous in his own right as the champion of a new kind of atheism. An intellectual very much of his heady, Germanic milieu, he was incandescent in his pronouncements on freedom and the common interests of humanity. In his own mind, and in the opinion of his followers, he was the philosopher of the future, whose humanism would light the way to a republican tomorrow, a tomorrow that dawned, then cruelly darkened, with the European revolutions of 1848. In the eyes of apologists for the established order, on the other hand, he was the most infamous infidel in an increasingly wicked age. The relevant fact for me, however, was that in one of his most influential books, Feuerbach describes the inherently conditional nature of consciousness with reference to the limited, leaf-centric consciousness of the caterpillar. That Douglass admired Feuerbach, I was able to confirm from the work of other scholars. I could also see it with my own eyes in his last home, now the Frederick Douglass Museum in Washington, D.C. where a bust of the German philosopher glowers from the mantelpiece overlooking Douglass's writing desk. Next to it sits a bust of David Friedrich Strauss, another German radical of the early 19th century, about whom more later. That Douglass read Feuerbach closely, to a point where he effortlessly appropriated the philosopher's idiosyncratic metaphors, is what the caterpillar seemed to indicate. But what was a free-thinking German insect metaphor doing in the thick of the American struggle over slavery? A certain kind of philosophical apparition seems to hover just outside the text of Abraham Lincoln's most famous writings. This ghost of philosophers past shows up most vividly in the address Lincoln delivered from the steps of the Capitol at the end of the rainy morning of his second inauguration, the last of his major speeches and the most intriguing. It steps out of the shadows in the most remarkable of the many remarkable sentences in that speech. Because that sentence supplies the axis on which much of the plot of this book turns, I quote it here in full, referring to the mighty scourge of war, scourge being a whip of the punitive kind. Lincoln says, "Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." This small collection of words packs more meaning than do many books. But there is also something strange about the way it combines a line from the Bible, "The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether," Psalm 19, verse 9, with a bracing vision of natural justice, every drop of blood. The pieces began to fit together, however, after I discovered what Frederick Douglass had to say about Lincoln's second inaugural address, and specifically about its most fascinating sentence. Douglass first took in the speech from the soggy street on the eastern side of the Capitol. That evening he walked up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House for the after-party. Once he got past the racist bouncers, Lincoln waved him over with warm familiarity. "I saw you in the crowd today, listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it?" the president asked. Douglass demurred, so Lincoln urged him on. "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours." "Mr. President, that was a sacred effort," Douglass replied. Douglass stakes out a complex range of views on Lincoln over his long career. In places, he hails the great emancipator as the black man's president. In other places, he drags the slow-moving, backward-looking white man's president. But on the topic of this speech, Douglass is unequivocal. In his third and final autobiography, published 2 decades after that second inauguration, he reproduces almost the entirety of Lincoln's address. Then he adds, "I know not how many times, and before how many people, I have quoted these solemn words of our martyred president. They struck me at the time, and have seemed to me ever since, to contain more vital substance than I have ever seen compressed in a space so narrow." In his commentaries on Lincoln's speech, Douglass often circles around that peculiar sentence about the mighty scourge of war. Just weeks after the assassination, he tells a group of mourners, "You remember with what solemn emphasis he expressed himself on the 4th of March, and then recites that specific sentence in full. Such a sentence I never heard from the lips of any man in his position before," he later says. In his subsequent writings and speeches, he reprises the same sentence so many times that on at least one occasion he slightly misquotes it, substituting bondage for unrequited toil and wasted for sunk, evidence that he was confident enough in its meaning that he would repeat it from memory without bothering to consult the original text. The source of his astonishment, Douglass makes clear, is the distinctive philosophical architecture that quietly sustains Lincoln's words. In the chosen sentence, says Douglass to his audience of mourners, Lincoln offers a recognition of the operation of inevitable and universal laws as old as eternity. In this war, he was willing to let justice have its course. Elsewhere, Douglass refers to the same universal laws as the self-executing laws of nature. According to this line of thought, the scourge of war has come down on the nation in the way that a storm might cause rivers to overflow their banks. The lash and the sword, like the wealth amassed through slavery and the destruction wrought by war, describe a crime that entails its own punishment, as if the misdeed and its consequences were merely distinct aspects of a singular chain of events connected through physical causes and effects. The moral universe Lincoln inhabits in this speech, in Douglass's eyes, will be familiar to students of America's first generation of revolutionaries as one ruled only by nature's God. Douglass's insight into Lincoln's thought world was keen, or so I came to believe, and something in the encounter with Lincoln reflects back on Douglass, illuminating the way he conceives of the great cause to which he dedicated the better part of his life and energy. In a memorable lecture of 1855, Douglass describes the nature and origins of America's anti-slavery movement in language that strangely anticipates his response to Lincoln's speech 10 years later. It is an error to speak of this venerable movement as a new thing under the sun. The causes producing it and the particles composing it, like the great forces of the physical world, fire, steam, and lightning, have slumbered in the bosom of nature since the world began. Whence are these elements? I trace them to nature and to nature's God. Lincoln's second inaugural address mattered so much to Douglass because Douglass grounded his own activism in the same philosophical vision he saw validated from the Capitol in that speech. Was nature's God really present in the American struggle over slavery, somewhere in between the lines of Lincoln's address and Douglass's free-thinking abolitionism? If so, how did it get there, and what was its role in the conflict? It isn't surprising that an inquiry into the philosophical origins of America's Second Revolution should settle on the figure of Theodore Parker. As influential as he was paradoxical, Parker was an icy New Englander with a yen for incendiary political machinations, a Unitarian minister who achieved fame upon his excommunication from the Unitarian Brotherhood, a universal reformer whose career ultimately came to be defined by his stand on the single issue of slavery, and the militant leader of a genuinely multiracial network of activists who nonetheless trafficked in racial stereotypes. Though typically relegated to the second rank in most accounts today, Parker played a dazzling role in the political, religious, and philosophical dimensions of the American struggle over slavery. Most relevant for this project, he was one of the principal vectors of German philosophy and scholarship in the New Republic. Among Parker's most ardent admirers were Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. He had a voice for the slave when nearly all the pulpits of the land were dumb, Douglass writes in his final autobiography. It was in his pulpit in Roxbury that I delivered my first anti-slavery speech. That its doors opened to me in that dark period was due to him. In a visit to Parker's tomb in Florence, Italy, where the heretic preacher had succumbed to tuberculosis on the eve of the war, Douglass eulogized him as the champion of the cause of human freedom, not only from physical chains, but the chains of superstition, those which marred and wounded the human soul. Parker's influence on Lincoln may have been even more consequential. That Lincoln had access to Parker and his writings we know from William Herndon, his sometimes hapless but ever-loyal law partner, sidekick, and biographer. Idolizing Parker almost as much as he did his own boss, Herndon regularly plied Lincoln with copies of the renegade minister's printed speeches and books, and the future president much admired and approved of what he read. Lincoln's close friend and fellow Illinoisan Jesse Fell, too, notes the affinity. If I was called upon to designate an author whose views most nearly represented Mr. Lincoln's, I would say that author was Theodore Parker. but we don't need to rely on the judgments of third parties to gauge the significance of the connection. Some of the unforgettable phrases that Lincoln engraved in the American identity, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, a house divided against itself cannot stand, and even fragments of that sentence from the second inaugural address cited earlier appear in some form in Parker's works well before making their way into Lincoln's speeches. The bonds that connected Parker, Douglass, and Lincoln were made of more than a few shared abstractions and turns of phrase. None of the three could be confined to that category of what used to be called men of ideas and are now faintly praised as public intellectuals. They were the kind of thinkers who regularly and enthusiastically converted ideas into action and then held on only to those ideas that make possible some useful change. In their activism, crucially, they interacted with one another in vital ways, and, to an extent that is not sufficiently appreciated in the historical narratives, they pushed one another forward. With some astonishingly bold endeavors that converged around the catalyzing figure of John Brown, they together forged some of the critical links in the chain of events that set Lincoln on the path to the presidency, the nation on the path to war, and the Union on the path to victory. Their interconnected story of philosophy in action was the kind that might one day serve as the basis of a movie about the war over slavery. Maybe the most surprising aspect of the story is the capacity for intellectual growth that its three protagonists shared. Neither Douglass, Lincoln, nor Parker was the same thinker at the end as at the beginning of the struggle. None quite knew where he was going until after getting most of the way there. Their story belongs to a certain genre of philosophical narrative, and it happens to be one that Lincoln himself identifies in his annual message to Congress of December 1862. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present, he says, by way of preparing the nation for the Emancipation Proclamation of the following month. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. The same journey toward a new consciousness of things, the kind of story in which caterpillars turn into butterflies, in a manner of speaking, is the moving element of the plot that connects Douglass, Parker, and Lincoln, and that explains their impact on the course of the American struggle over slavery. It is our good fortune to have outlived those hoary narratives according to which the American Civil War was a brother-against-brother struggle over a lost cause. Sensible observers today will agree that Lincoln was right when he said, in his second inaugural address, that slavery was somehow the cause of the war. But how exactly did American slavery lead to war? Why did that war result in emancipation? And what meaning does the war over slavery have for us now, especially in view of the subsequent betrayals of its revolutionary ideals? The chain of events that links Douglass, Parker, and Lincoln invites a fresh perspective on these vital questions. In the stories that Americans tell themselves today about slavery, many familiar culprits are rightly called to account. Yet one of the prime suspects typically gets a pass. Flip between the original sources and the tales later told, and the omission is blatant. Where did the religion go? In most of the histories, the American religion of the time either is set aside as a thin cover for material interests and prejudices already established, or shows up on the side of the angels. But that is not the reality that Douglass, Lincoln, and Parker describe. American Christianity is the bulwark of slavery, its darkest aspect, and the most difficult to attack, says Douglass. Lincoln effectively agrees. Parker is harsher, if anything. While believers could be found on all sides of the conflict, a certain dominant variety of American religion, in both North and South, was a cornerstone of the slave system, as essential to its workings as the racism with which it colluded. The fundamental aim of the slaveholding oligarchy in initiating the war was not merely to secede, but to reorganize the entire Union around an ideology that today we would classify as a form of religious fascism. The fundamental aim of America's anti-slavery leaders was not only to end slavery, but also to defeat this existential threat to democracy itself. Although the slaveholders' project failed, their ideology and the threat it represents live on in successor religious nationalist movements in America and around the world. Many of the popular narratives today have rightly drawn attention to the grinding racial inequality around which the machinery of American slavery turned. Rather, few devote similar attention to the economic inequality that also characterized the slave system. Most take for granted that slavery created wealth by extracting it from one race for the benefit of another. According to Douglass, Lincoln, and Parker, on the other hand, slavery did not create wealth, but rather destroyed it, even as it concentrated what was left in even fewer hands. Considered in the aggregate, it transferred wealth not merely from one race to another, but from the many of all races to the few of one race. The resulting economic inequality was at least as consequential as the racial divide, and even to some extent the cause of it. The rise of a parasitic oligarchy, as rich, powerful, arrogant, reckless, and destructive as any aristocracy the world has seen, was the fundamental cause of the escalating disputes preceding the shooting war and of the war itself, or so they, correctly I think, maintain. The defeat of this oligarchy, conversely, called upon an economic alliance that, however imperfectly and impermanently, united rather than divided races. The underappreciation of inequality, broadly understood, helps explain another curious omission in the favored narratives today. There were many heroes in the struggle for emancipation, and quite a few are still celebrated. The military leaders and their battles, for example, could hardly ask for more detailed coverage in the current literature. But whatever happened to the philosophers that Douglass admired and their ideas? Enlightenment barely figures in most of our histories of the Civil War, and in some versions it is denounced as incurably racist, a merely white enlightenment to be numbered among the enemies of freedom. Yet for Douglass, Lincoln, and Parker, philosophy was an indispensable guide on the road to emancipation. They turned to reason because, as they understood it, reason is the great enemy of unreasonable distributions of wealth. They counted the rise of pro-slavery religion and the deprecation of the Enlightenment among the most pernicious consequences of inequality. The profound philosophical meditations in Lincoln's addresses were not mere ornamentation supplied by some overeducated speechwriter for hire. They are the souvenirs of a very personal philosophical journey that shaped the way he understood and acted in the great conflict over which he presided. Like Douglass, he turned to philosophy not for the validation of dogmas, but for the removal of those blinders that prevented a clear view of the struggle for freedom. Their story is about an emancipation of the mind as much as of the body. That story of philosophical disenthrallment, as they also understood, was essentially a global one. In most of the prevailing narratives, the history of the American struggle over slavery is told in a thoroughly and unself-consciously American way, as if the new republic inhabited a planet of its own. In recent decades, historians have drawn attention to the global aspects of the trade in slaves and in the fruits of their labor. They have been less alert to the worldwide commerce and ideas. Yet Douglass, Parker, and Lincoln participated in an intellectual debate that spanned continents, and they knew it. The free-thinking caterpillar that crawled into Douglass's lectures on photography was not there by accident. It is one trace of a global process whose outcome would have been vastly different had the United States indeed been as splendidly isolated as it sometimes imagines itself to be. The global intellectual context of the American struggle over slavery invites us to think again about the place of the war over slavery in American history. Today, the blame for slavery and the bloody conflict to which it gave rise is often laid entirely on America's founders. All you need to know about 1776, some interpreters seem to suggest, is that Thomas Jefferson was a racist slaveholder. The leaders of the anti-slavery cause, on the other hand, mostly had a very different take on the American founding. The rise of a Christian slave republic in North America, they understood, was the work of a counter-revolutionary movement that originated in the northern states after independence and consciously set itself against the ideals and achievements of the first American Revolution. It would not be the last such counter-revolutionary movement in American history, though it remains the only one to have initiated a major land war against the Republic. Although that war took the form of a sectional conflict, it is best understood as a slave insurrection by proxy that evolved naturally into a revolutionary workers' war and ultimately into a fight for the rights of all humans against the rights of property. Notwithstanding their appreciation of the imperfections and mistakes of America's first generation of revolutionaries, Douglass, Lincoln, and Parker saw themselves to the last breath as champions of the American Revolution and Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, because that is what they were. What bound these leaders of the anti-slavery cause to America's original founders, however, was not the commitment to preserve the Union, but the promise to make the world anew. And, to an extent that remains underappreciated today, they kept that promise. The idea of America that we celebrate today, the one against which we constantly test an imperfect reality, dates not from 1776 or 1787, but from 1865. It is well and good that Washington and the rest of the crowd that populate most of our banknotes are the subject of so much interest today. It is not okay that they appear to rank above the many extraordinary individuals who created the Republic as we now know it. The story of America's refounders, which is much more than just the story of Lincoln, needs to come first. The tale this book recounts is therefore quite simple and maybe even old-fashioned. It features heroes and villains, and it tells of triumphs and disappointments, as I think any story about the American struggle over slavery must, so long as there are people today who believe that tomorrow can be better than today. It takes for granted that ideas matter, and that they trace a visible arc through the disorder of human history. The plot starts with a radical philosophical vision that originated in early modern Europe and drew its initial strength from its encounters with the people and the circumstances of the New World. This radical vision achieved a limited practical expression in the first American Revolution, and then again in successor revolutions, notably in France and Haiti. In the early American Republic, its force dissipated under the growing pressure of a counter-revolutionary slaveholding oligarchy. The dream was nonetheless revived and reformulated in the cafes and classrooms of Germany and elsewhere in Europe in the context of the revolutions of 1848. Having suffered defeat there in the reactionary aftermath, it emigrated back across the ocean, often penniless but still burning with ambition, to ignite the refounding of the American Republic in its second revolution. 1. We must disenthrall ourselves. Henny's fate. The people came from far away to be saved, in covered wagons and ox carts, by foot, and on a pair of packed steamboats. In the middle of the wide green field by the bay, they found an altar of wooden planks and an enclosed pen laid with straw where the fallen could kneel. Long rows of seats stretched off into the Maryland sunshine. Family tents ringed the open-air temple, in order of wealth, with the stateliest ones crowding the stage. By the afternoon of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?